Fantastic. So, hi everyone. My name is Erin Houston. I am the training and education coordinator with Body Brave. Um, and so I I have been with Body Brave for a number of years. Since I was a master's student doing my master's placement in social justice and community engagement. I'm also someone with lived experience of an eating disorder. So I bring kind of a few different lenses um, into the topic. And so I can only really present from my experience, both professional and personal, in terms of um, what what we're talking about today, and obviously it's much more complex and diverse um, than what I'm able to offer in an hour and a half. So do just want to name that, um, but hopefully we still get lots out of this conversation, and it kind of helps you guys in feeling prepared for the work that you do, and working with individuals as well. So this is a training that we typically kind of call these trainings with community groups and other groups, just eating disorder sensitive, building capacity for care, really just tailoring it to your group, to the YWCA in terms of what kind of information you might need, how you might need to talk about things, and those kinds of pieces. So we always start with a land acknowledgement. I'm sure that's also common practice for you. So especially as an eating disorder treatment and support center and organization, it's really, really important for us to acknowledge the land and acknowledge the ways that land impacts people's relationship with food. So Body Brave is on the traditional territories of the Erie, the Neutral, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas. And it's territory that's covered by the Upper Canada Treaties, and it's right kind of beside the Haldimand Treaty territory as well. So we really specifically like to reference that we work with body image issues and eating disorders, and that Indigenous peoples are often left out of those spaces in terms of research and treatment and recovery spaces and conversations surrounding stigma and support and all of those kinds of things. So it's really our responsibility to acknowledge that, to acknowledge the ways in which land and land theft affects people's relationship to food, to their traditional ways of food. Access to water obviously impacts people's health, people's ability to sustain themselves, and their relationship with their bodies, and all of those pieces as well. So it's a very interconnected system, as I'm sure you all know, but really important for us to, just acknowledge the ways that land directly impacts the clients that we work with. And the Indigenous clients who show up in our spaces. So always just want to make sure that we are naming that. Today's objectives. So really hoping that you kind of just walk away from the session with an increased confidence in like identifying disordered eating, and kind of those early intervention pieces of just noticing red flags or yellow flags in terms of what that might look like for the community members that you're working with. Explore available supports for community members, so kind of knowing how to help them navigate systems and kind of wayfind within eating disorder support systems in the Hamilton area, and then increase capacity for supporting community members if they're waiting for their treatment or if they're waiting to see just like a specialized person, just how you can kind of best support people who might be receiving additional supports. So those are kind of the main things that we want to walk away with. Body Brave, if you don't know, we're a charitable nonprofit treatment and support center that supports people with eating disorders. Originally kind of like located in Hamilton, but since the onset, before the pandemic, we were about 50% virtual. Since the onset of the pandemic, we are obviously 100% virtual, and we are going to remain that way. It really helps in terms of accessibility. Due with our like insurance and those kinds of pieces, we are able to support people all over Ontario, so we can reach rural areas and northern areas and all of those pieces, which is really, really important to us. So we offer low barrier treatment, so it's all free of cost. We have group support, individual psychotherapy. We have doctors who can do medical assessments. And then we have more kind of like low barrier self-guided pieces that people can kind of do on their own. So depending on what people's needs are, we try to meet the needs of as many people as we can. And then there's my little island, which is the education island. So I work a lot with professionals, so social workers, physicians, dietitians and just kind of building their capacity for caring for patients or clients or community members who are struggling with eating disorders. So that's the work that we do. We're a small but mighty team. And yeah, that's kind of the lens through which we'll be talking about some of these pieces. Before we get started, are there any questions at all? Okay. Excellent. No problem. Gosh, I recently got 3 screens and I thought it would make my life easier, but when I'm presenting, it really doesn't. But that's a me problem. We're going to start just with a super kind of like base, wanting to really understand and kick off the conversation with a brief introduction to eating disorders and really kind of like fleshing out what it is we're talking about and how eating disorders and disordered eating show up in your work and in the community members that you work with. So right off the bat, I'd love to hear I'm not looking for a specific answer. I have no expectations with this question, but what is your understanding of disordered eating, or what words come up when you hear the term eating disorder, or just what are kind of like the main things that you think about in your understanding, or kind of like the shared societal knowledge of eating disorders? Feel free to put them in the chat. You can also unmute if you'd like, but yeah, mental health and body image, yeah, absolutely. So they kind of fall into like those categories, a weird like Venn diagram of mental health and body image issues. Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, society definitely, like the role that society plays in terms of creating an environment in which eating disorders and disordered eating are like normalized and encouraged in a lot of ways. Bulimia, absolutely, yeah. So a specific diagnosis, difficult relationships with food, a great like, yeah, kind of umbrella way to describe disordered eating. Media, the role that media plays, a complex thing that arises due to a lot of factors, often related to a sense of lack of control. Yeah, absolutely. Emphasis on the word complex, for sure. And we'll kind of get into the sense of control pieces as well. Awesome. That was a great array of words, and hopefully we'll kind of touch on all of those pieces. But just kind of like, yeah, good to know where people are at. So this is a lot on one screen. We'll walk through it. But when we talk about eating disorders, we often, or we like to explain them as occurring kind of on a spectrum. And so we are all, as people who have a relationship with food because we have to eat, we are all somewhere along this spectrum at any kind of given time, depending on a lot of different pieces. So on one side, we have wellness. That can look like, body positive of having like a good relationship with your body and food. It could also be body neutral, in which you don't think about it a lot either way. Both are excellent ways of existing. So having mostly positive or neutral feelings about your body. There aren't good or bad foods. You're not restricting in any certain way. You're able to exercise because you want to and stop when you want to, those kinds of things. That's kind of what wellness looks like on this continuum. And then we get into preoccupation with food and body. And so this is where, yeah, the aspects of society and media kind of really, really play a role, because a lot of times this section here is kind of what people understand the bench post of wellness to be, and the idea that this is kind of where all people live or should be living. So it's kind of a preoccupation with food in your body. You don't like the way parts of your body looks. You're kind of consistently wanting to lose a few pounds or gain muscle or whatever that looks like. Frequent thoughts about food and eating and body. It takes up, quite a bit of kind of your brain space or your thinking processes. And then sometimes feeling guilty or bad for what you've eaten or how much you've eaten, and the feeling of needing to compensate for that in some kind of way. So that's the conversations around having to like burn off those calories, or I'll have to go to the gym after this, or those kinds of things. Those things live in that section. The next is disordered eating symptoms. And so this is where that preoccupation with food in your body turns into things that really interfere with your daily activities. Maybe that's your relationships, maybe that's what you have the capacity to do because you're preoccupied or thinking about other things. Maybe it's because your energy levels are low because you're not eating an adequate enough amount of food or those kinds of things. But it's when that preoccupation with food in your body starts to interfere with your daily life. So there might be rigidity in your eating patterns, black and white thinking about food, working hard to change your body in some way, shape, or form, those kinds of things. And then here on the screen right there is where we kind of imagine the little gate to actually like a diagnosable eating disorder. And the gate is there because diagnoses can really be kind of like a gatekeeper to care and to a medical diagnosis. And so a lot of people who really do struggle with eating disorders that affects their lives and their wellness will not be diagnosed with an eating disorder. And that's why in our work, it's really important that we don't require a diagnosis because so often people are not able to receive them for a multitude of reasons: access to care, the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistic Manual, is scaled to very white Western norms. For a really long time, anyone without a uterus could not be diagnosed with anorexia because a lack of menses or menstrual period was a required part of the diagnosis. So the diagnoses are fairly flawed and hard to get. And so it's really important that we recognize the severity of this column, and we don't necessarily wait for things to get into this column before taking action and offering support and doing what we can, because so often people are not able to get to that final column when a lot of people kind of will begin to take them seriously. So a diagnosis does not indicate severity. It doesn't indicate how much they're struggling. People can be struggling in any of the other columns. So whether you're working with a community member who has a diagnosis or is like self-diagnosed or maybe just recognizes your own disordered eating symptoms, it's important to kind of develop your capacity for having conversations about disordered eating. People may not have a diagnosis or want a diagnosis, but might still meet that diagnostic criteria. And regardless, they're very much struggling with disordered eating. So it's important to think about disordered eating on this continuum and what that looks like, recognizing the gate that exists right here, recognizing that our society very much like normalizes and celebrates all of us living right here. So there's kind of a lot of nuance within this continuum, but this is kind of a helpful way to think about it and to kind of be able to recognize and place ourselves or people that we're working with somewhere kind of on this spectrum. So disordered eating behavior, so that symptom column, a lot of pieces can kind of fall into that, and this is of course a non-exhaustive list, but some of the kind of more common ones that you might see in someone who is experiencing disordered eating. So restriction in eating, that's kind of the common one that we see in disordered eating. Fasting, obviously for like non-religious or cultural reasons, but choosing to fast for a certain period of time. This also includes intermittent fasting, which is kind of like a masculine bro way of talking about disordered eating. It's like a very interesting topic. Eating past the point of fullness or feeling out of control while eating, that kind of falls into like the binge eating category. So not having a sense of control. And we'll talk about kind of the nuances of that in a bit. Avoiding a type of food or food group, again, not for cultural reasons or not, vegetarianism is not necessarily a disordered eating behavior, but that's kind of like a flag to note of are they trying to restrict their intake based on certain rules or certain groups of foods or those kinds of things. Self-induced vomiting, that's kind of the like stereotype in terms of what we see in terms of bulimia, but lots of pieces kind of fall into bulimia. Excessive exercise, so exercising past tiredness when you're sick or when you're the weather isn't good or those kinds of things, but feeling a compulsion to exercise as a result of compensating for what you've eaten or how you've eaten. Laxative, diuretic, or enema use. That looks different for different people. But that's when that, again, you're kind of compensating for what has been eaten. Steroid or creatine use, that's normally more seen in trying to build up muscle, in what we kind of call muscle dysmorphia. Use of diet pills, and the misuse of insulin to impact appetite as well. And that is kind of colloquially known as diabulimia. And someone with diabetes changing their insulin use to keep themselves not feeling hunger, so that they can restrict their intake. So this is just like, again, kind of tip of the iceberg. Does not necessarily encompass all the pieces, but these are kind of the more common ones that we might see, and pieces that kind of come up. What causes eating disorders? So this is a super complex topic, which I'm glad, I think was Danny who brought up the word complexity. And so it's important to kind of talk about these pieces. So in a lot of ways, dieting and choosing to diet can be a big risk factor for eating disorders, but it's important to recognize that eating disorders are not just like diets gone wrong. There are a lot of other pieces. A term that we kind of use a lot in eating disorders is genetics loads the gun, but environment pulls the trigger. So there's a lot of kind of moving parts in what actually causes someone to struggle with an eating disorder. And so there's a combination of a lot of different factors. So biological, we just did a whole session yesterday, which was really, really cool, on the neuroscience of eating disorders. So actual brain chemistry, makeup of your brain, that can impact your relationship with food, your like reward system in terms of like, does food reward you in a specific way? So it's been found that people who struggle with binge eating have like fairly intense reward systems that really reward them when they eat food. People who struggle with anorexia might have like less reward when it comes to food. So there is like a brain neurochemistry, makeup, genetics, all of those kinds of things that does play a role, and that is important to think about. Obviously, we can't know that by talking to someone, but it's important to kind of know the roles that all those different factors play. Socio-cultural factors. So those are kind of the outside factors that we have. So, social media, beauty standards that are completely unrealistic, expectations from family and peers, discrimination, oppression. So, racism, homophobia, transphobia, all of those pieces also obviously play a huge role. And then psychological factors. So, we often hear quite a bit about kind of like perfectionism as a role that, or something that plays a role in disordered eating. How people respond to stress, what their coping tools are, all of those kinds of things. So kind of like personality and emotions and attitudes also play a role. And so a lot of these factors kind of have to coexist in weird, specific, certain ways that cause an eating disorder. So as much as it is really important to understand the role that dieting plays in like normalizing disordered eating, that dieting itself is not like the only cause of an eating disorder. There are a lot of other kind of factors that are at play that we cannot understand or know about, or like see ourselves. Important kind of additional increased risk factors that are important for us to talk about, especially when we're working with populations that both of our organizations are working with, is kind of these additional increased risk factors. So adverse childhood experiences, known as like ACEs, so experiences of abuse, neglect, household mental illness, parental separation or divorce, those kinds of things can play a role. So experiences of trauma, sexual violence, all of those pieces do play a role. Eating disorders almost never occur kind of in isolation. There is kind of normally these kinds of risk factors that play a role in someone's experience. Familial factors, so parents or family members who are experiencing disordered eating, or who model disordered eating outside of kind of the genetic component. But if you're in a space where someone is always trying to restrict their food or has an unhealthy relationship with food, that can obviously kind of increase increase your risk as you pick up on those things as coping strategies. Experiences of structural discrimination, which we'll get into a bit more, and gender dysphoria, which we'll touch on quite a bit more. And those are some of the kind of additional increased risk factors that it's important that kind of like surround that Venn diagram in terms of the risk of eating disorders. I'm not super worried about it with this group, but in some groups it's really, really important to talk about how aspects of identity play a role in the development of eating disorders or disordered eating. There is a stereotype of the thin, white, middle-class teenage girl who struggles with anorexia. I say that as someone who was a thin, white, middle-class teenage girl who struggled with anorexia. So I think I can say it, but that's kind of like the stereotype of what we see. And that is like not anywhere near the most common kind of pieces. Anorexia is one of the least common eating disorders, but it's kind of the most the one that we don't really hear about the most, because in our culture that loves dieting and thinness, it's kind of like the most revered. So there's lots of different pieces that are kind of at play. So important to talk about and kind of sprinkle in pieces that make sure that we're not thinking through that lens, or to kind of help us get out of that lens. So these are some kind of like stats, research stats in terms of eating disorders within marginalized communities. So Black folks are less likely to be diagnosed with anorexia than white people, but may have symptoms for longer. So a lot of factors in terms of like medical racism, healthcare provider bias, all of those kinds of things. Healthcare professionals are half as likely to diagnose someone with an eating disorder if they're in a larger body. So we have this idea that, if someone is in a larger body and they are restricting, that's, great. They're trying to be healthy. Wonderful. If someone is in a smaller body and restricting, then it's an eating disorder. And so healthcare professionals bias in terms of size-based discrimination and those pieces also play a big role. People of color with self-acknowledged eating disorder and weight concerns were less likely to be asked about their symptoms by a clinician. So again, and less likely to receive help for their eating disorder despite similar prevalence rates with white population. So just really noticing that a lot of times these assumptions and stereotypes in terms of what eating disorders look like and how they show up in people and who can affect them prevents those who don't fit the stereotype from receiving support and receiving kind of early intervention, which is a huge part of disordered eating. The earlier that it's recognized and noticed, and the sooner someone receives support, plays a huge role in terms of their ability to recover and the health impact it takes on their body. There's a 53% increase in men being hospitalized for eating disorder related issues between 1999 and 2009. I mean, it's been like 13 years since that stat, but part of that is a change in diagnosis. The diagnoses themselves within the DSM were extremely sexist in terms of only women or only people with uteruses can be diagnosed for certain things, those kinds of pieces. And so it really was thought that men did not or could not struggle with disordered eating, which we know is aggressively not true. 20-30% of people with an existing eating disorder also have autism spectrum disorder. So people with disabilities who struggle with physical or intellectual disabilities often kind of have feeding or eating issues that kind of fit into the category of disordered eating. So that's like problems chewing, like selectivity in terms of like texture, temperature, like food pickiness, those kinds of things. They often kind of fall into an eating disorder category called ARFID, which is avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. And it's very similar to anorexia, but without kind of like the fear of gaining weight. So there's not a lot of that like body image that necessarily plays a role. Someone who struggles with ARFID might actually be wanting to gain weight, but because of kind of these feeding and eating issues that they struggle with, they are not able to. So that is another huge component for people who have autism, are on the autism spectrum, or have some of the kind of like autism qualities that, even if they don't have a diagnosis of it, might be struggling with. A really important thing that Sandra wanted to make sure that we touched on, so I made a whole bunch of slides about it because I think it's so important, is to us LGBTQIA folks and disordered eating, and the role that disordered eating plays in their relationships with themselves and their bodies and those kinds of pieces. To us LGBTQIA is the acronym that we use. I'm not sure if that is what you guys use, but hopefully that kind of encompasses the populations that you were working with and talking about and how you're talking with them. So starting with just like the minority stress model in terms of the role that it plays in mental health disparities with sexual and gender minority groups. So it, explains that individuals from these populations experience unique stressors, stigma, discrimination, internalized homophobia or transphobia, desire to conceal their sexual or gender identity, which, lead to increased risks for the development of physical and mental health issues. So this is kind of a way of explaining the increased risk that to us LGBTQIA folks might experience, and you can kind of see the many different layers. And so that's kind of what we're going to dive into is what that looks like. Basically, researchers found that to us LGBTQIA folks, experience higher rates of stigma, are more likely to report disordered eating, and that like shame and concealment of their sexual and gender identity and discrimination increases that risk. Just got a note. So, oh my gosh, yes, I'm so sorry. I had a whole note on trigger warnings at the beginning of this. I'm going through this information fast. It's a lot. I explore it on a day-to-day basis, and so I can sometimes move fairly quickly through it, wanting to get all the information to you. It can take your time to digest it, to think about it, and do what you need to do to kind of take care of yourself in this space. It's being recorded. You can see it later. There is no pressure to stay in this space if you are feeling uncomfortable or any of those pieces. Thank you for naming that. I totally had a note to say that at the top, and then I just get excited about talking about these topics. But yeah, take the time that you need to digest. Turn your camera off, close your eyes. You can just listen. Whatever you need to do, you can mute me and just read the slides. Whatever you kind of feel works best for you in this space. Absolutely, these can be intense topics. A lot of us either are in this space or love people who are in this space of struggling with disordered eating and eating disorders and body image issues and all of those things. So yes, thank you very much to the person who brought that up for me. They're really, really important. Take the time that you need. You can come back to it. There is no pressure to engage in a specific way in terms of this content. So thank you. Yes, so kind of the stigma around to us LGBTQIA folks can really increase their risk of eating disorders. And so this is kind of a research list in terms of those contributing factors. So experiences of harm or violence, discrimination, fear of, or experiences of rejection from their family, from friends, from partners, internalized negative messages or beliefs. So ideas about what a female body looks like or a male body looks like or an androgynous body looks like, all of those pieces, and then pressure to meet those body ideals. So those are some of the kind of contributing factors that impact the 2S LGBTQIA population in terms of what that looks like. Really want to highlight trans and gender non-conforming folks, including non-binary folks, in terms of these conversations, because body image can play such a huge role in their experiences of their own gender, of their identity, on all of those pieces. So research on transgender and gender nonconforming folks is obviously, I mean, not obviously, unfortunately, very much in its infancy. We're kind of seeing a lot more of that important research being done now, but so it's been found that eating pathology or disordered eating is prevalent in trans and gender nonconforming groups, and that they experience eating disorders at higher rate than their cisgender counterparts do. So a 2015 study found that transgender youth are 4 times more likely to suffer from an eating disorder and twice as likely to engage in purging or self-induced vomiting. A Canadian study found that transgender youth who experience more frequent harassment and discrimination were more likely to have eating disorder symptoms. And so, this is a very real reality that we want to make sure that we are talking about and touching on, and really, really highlighting as an important part of the conversation around eating disorders and disordered eating. So transgender adults and adolescents reported higher incidence of a lot of these disordered eating behaviors. And so really important that we recognize that. This is a quote that I think kind of sums it up well, but distress regarding body parts related to an individual's undesired assigned sex and body shame may be highly linked to body dissatisfaction for transgender individuals, as well as feelings that as well as feelings that a change in one's body size could subsequently change levels of masculinity or femininity in one appearance. So oftentimes society at large kind of bases an individual's gender validity on how well they present or how closely they kind of adhere to, the agreed upon ideas of what gender is supposed to look like or behave like, or the size that they're supposed to be, and all those things. So this really has the potential and creates an environment in which transgender and gender nonconforming folks are struggle to achieve a very unnatural idea and fit into a mold of what society deems as binary genders or those kinds of pieces. And so so it's really important to make note of that. So for trans folks, their experience of disordered eating might not stem from a general desire to lose weight, but things that like directly connect to their gender identity. So attempt to stunt breast growth, alter their body shape so that the size of their hips, or I can't think of the word, but like, proportions, their body proportions in some way that more adhere to societal ideas of gender body proportions. Want to eliminate menstruation. So if you are strict long enough, your body kind of starts to shut down, and people with uteruses often lose their ability to menstruate, which for someone who does not want to be menstruating, that's a part of kind of that part of their identity, and then wanting to lose or gain muscle mass to again kind of better fit those pieces. So when we talk about what recovery or support or care needs to look like life-saving for someone with anorexia can be like trying to change their perspective instead of trying to change their body. But life-saving for a trans person could be changing their body in ways that are life-affirming rather than disordered. And so maybe that means gender-affirming surgeries or hormone therapy or any of those pieces. But when we talk about you just need to like change your perspective, it's very dismissive of trans and gender nonconforming folks experiences of disordered eating and their experiences of their body and what that looks like. Want to touch on dysmorphia and dysphoria, two kind of different things that sound very similar, so you got to be careful. And there are many overlapping traits, so it can be really, really hard for trans and gender nonconforming folks to kind of navigate their experiences of gender dysphoria or body dysmorphia. And so many folks might experience both, but one person is not necessarily struggling with both. So Gender dysphoria is kind of like the disconnection or distress around one's like gendered body experience. And then body dysmorphia is obsessive focus on like perceived flaws and like general body things, not necessarily related to gender. For trans or gender nonconforming folks, they can be an intense overlap between those things. But just because someone is experiencing gender dysphoria and feeling disconnected to their like gendered body experience does not necessarily mean they're struggling with body dysmorphia, and vice versa. So they are two different things, but they can both be playing a role in terms of a trans and gender nonconforming person's experience of their body. This is a really, again, kind of important quote. The monolithic trans narrative that we are told is that trans people are born in the wrong bodies and that they hate the bodies that they've been trapped in. This narrative often erases the countless experiences of binary and non-binary trans folks who never felt like they were born in the wrong body. Because this narrative is too often told, people, including doctors, come to believe it as a truth for all trans people. So there are lots of trans and gender nonconforming folks who do not want to change their body in terms of like surgery or hormone replacements or any of those kinds of things. That's not the, always the narrative that is happening. So it's important that for trans and gender nonconforming folks who are struggling with disordered eating or trying to change their body, that we don't automatically assume it's connected to their gender. Or connected to their gendered body experience, but taking the time to kind of help them flesh out what it is, where it's coming from, and those kinds of pieces. And it very well could be stemming from those things, but it's not always. So, non-binary and trans folks may have the desire to change their body as it relates to their gender identity, but we cannot assume that is a universal experience for all people who are trans and gender nonconforming. So part of developing a positive body image for trans or non-binary folks means having a place that allows them to explore gender in a safe and supportive environment. So they have ways to explore their gender and what that means for them outside of just their gendered body experience. So especially for folks who are living in households where it's not safe to wear different clothes or dress in androgynous ways or go by a different name or those kinds of things, what they eat and how they actually like physically change their body could be the only part of their gendered experience that they have control over. And so when we can create safe places for people to explore their gender in ways outside of their physicality, that can be really, really empowering for people. So we want to really build supportive communities that offer tools to help people kind of walk through those experiences. So these are some of the pieces that might play a role. And I do encourage you to kind of like think about your programming and the role that you play in your work and what this could look like in your programming specifically. But obviously the general bare minimum, acknowledge and affirm identities as determined by the individual. That includes pronouns, how they reference partners or potential partners, what their kind of level of outness with you or their community or their family is. Ensure gender neutral language is kind of the norm, especially when talking about reproductive health or sexual health or relationship status. Really kind of, that gender neutral approach can help kind of maintain their sense of control in terms of their narrative for themselves and their own body experience. Anticipate additional support that they may need. So going to the doctor for a trans person is not always just going for the doctor or going to the doctor. It's that, maybe their family members, they don't want their family members to know, so it's needing a different ride. It's not having, a home address, so they can't get a health card or provider bias in knowing that they might need additional support after going to the doctor or after seeing a healthcare professional. Just trying to anticipate what those needs are so that you can kind of best support people. Continue to develop your knowledge regarding trans specific and related healthcare needs. So, learning what you can about what the realities of transgender specific healthcare needs are in Ontario, what those look like, just making sure that you kind of best support people if they do approach you and do kind of need that support. And then recognizing the limitations of body positivity. So again, there are a lot of narratives that we say that are meant to be body positive and celebrate our bodies, such as, you know, all bodies are good bodies, there's nothing wrong with your body, those kinds of things. But that really does dismiss the experience of trans folks who's, you know, the body that they are in, and the gender that it portrays to the world is not what they want. It's not a good body to them. And so just really wanting to make sure that we are not that we are creating space for that kind of nuance, and instead kind of focusing on, you know, even if you don't like your body, you have to respect your body, and those kinds of things that are a little bit more neutral, that create space for that nuance in terms of what it means to take care of your body the way it is, even if there are things that that you would want to change, or that would help you to better express yourself. Are there any questions about those pieces? So we talked about kind of the general disordered eating, we talked about 2S LGBTQIA folks, and body image issues. Hopefully that kind of covered some of the pieces and answered some questions. That was a section that, yeah, was Sandra really wanted to make sure that we touched on. So I worked on it as best I could to make sure I touched on a lot of the pieces that might come up. But if you have any additional questions or just things that you kind of want to be working through with your team, or things, definitely just like write those down or let me know, however you can. Okay. The next little section is disordered eating concerns that are specific to frontline workers. So when you're working directly with community members who might be struggling, and just what that looks like. There are like specific slides in this that I want to pay more attention to than others, and so some I might be moving through quickly, but the interesting ones I promise I'll spend some time on. Okay, the first thing to talk about is not obviously, but trauma. So experiences of trauma amongst community members are obviously play a big role. There's an increasing amount of literature that suggests that people with eating disorders, and that many of people with eating disorders also have a history of psychological trauma. But it is really hard for research to exactly understand how trauma relates to disordered eating. So, you know, it can be separate. So someone might be struggling with disordered eating, having experiences of trauma. Disordered eating is already kind of their coping tool, or a way that they manage stress or whatever, and so they're kind of separate in that way. Trauma might kind of exacerbate pathology. So if someone is already struggling, and then they experience trauma, it kind of like increases the disordered eating that they experience, or those kinds of things. Or they can also be intertwined. So especially if trauma, you know, abuse or neglect is happening in the home, it can very often be related to food, and so the trauma around food can be a really kind of core part of the eating disorder. So food, hunger, like bodily discomfort, can be kind of used as like a physical manifestation for pain. Restricting food could be a form of self-punishment, all of those kinds of pieces. And so it's hard to kind of know exactly what that looks like for each individual person, but just knowing that there is often kind of a relationship or a correlation between these two pieces of someone's life. And so to help kind of explain this trauma piece, we like to talk about the functions of disordered eating. So, you know, most of the time, disordered eating behaviors or symptoms serve a purpose for the person who is struggling with them. They don't exist in a vacuum, but there's a reason or a purpose. And obviously that's not to say that it's a choice, but disordered eating or those kinds of pieces is one of the coping tools that they have to help serve some of these purposes. And so then part of recovery or helping get past disordered eating is developing new coping tools, or recognizing what the function is, so that we can develop new ways of kind of processing these pieces. So disordered eating as a tool for self-soothing. So especially binge eating or what people call emotional eating, which I don't love. Emotional eating is not automatically a disordered eating thing. At the end of a long day, I'm gonna have a bowl of ice cream because I've had a long day and I want a bowl of ice cream, and like maybe I'm sad and eating ice cream. That's not necessarily a disordered eating thing. Food is more than fuel. Food is community and relationships and culture and emotion, and that's not a bad thing. Um, and so, emotional eating itself is not necessarily a problem when it is kind of the only coping tool that someone has, when it's impacting other aspects of their life or their health or those kinds of things, not in terms of weight necessarily, but in terms of like nutrition value and that kind of stuff, then it can become a problem. But so if eating is kind of like the only tool that someone has in terms of self-soothing, that can be a problem. I'm not going to stop eating my ice cream at the end of the day. Not going to happen. Social reinforcement. So, when I was struggling with anorexia, the number of little church ladies who have told me I looked great, that served a purpose for me. That was like, okay, you're doing a good job. People are noticing. People think you look okay. That served a purpose. Preservation of relationships. So if they're in a relationship in which their partner or their family members want them to be looking a certain way, or want them to be eating a certain way, that can play a role. Avoidance of sexuality, we kind of touched on that a bit in certain ways. Also wanting to kind of change your body to help protect yourself from traumatic experiences. So wanting to like make yourself gain weight so that you are less appealing to people who might want to harm you or those kinds of things. Punishment or self-harm. So restrictive eating or eating past the point of fullness, that's kind of a way of punishing yourself. Self-concept, so really kind of developing or disordered eating as a tool for developing a sense of identity can play a role. Maintaining control often comes up in these conversations, and is kind of a big one in terms of the functions. Wanting a sense of control over yourself or your environment. If you don't have control in other ways, food is kind of one of the only outlets you might have in terms of feeling that sense of control. And then coping with negative emotions and avoidance of memory as well. And so that can look different for different people. But so this is obviously not exhaustive, but these cover a lot of kind of the important ones in terms of, disordered eating does not happen because just because someone wants to lose weight or is restricting or had a bad day. Their disordered eating serves a purpose for that person. And we have to recognize that, because that is a huge part of recovery, because then we can get at, okay, what other tools do we need? What other supports does this person need to help serve that purpose that isn't disordered eating? And then we kind of really get into kind of the emotional side of things, which is really, really important for supporting people. Food and housing insecurity plays a huge role. I did a training a couple weeks ago for foster parents. And so this was kind of like the entirety of the presentation was talking about histories of food and housing insecurity and the role that plays in someone struggling with disordered eating. So studies have found that households with the highest level of food insecurity, which in this study was described as like the adults in the household reported the children having to go hungry. So oftentimes if you're in a food insecure space, adults will try to give children as much food as possible, and the adults will go hungry themselves. In households when the children as well as the adults were going hungry, they tended to engage in higher levels of disordered eating, of dietary restraint, internalized weight concerns, compensating for things when they did eat, and all of those pieces. And so there's kind of this idea that if you don't have access to food on a regular basis, you're probably just grateful when you do get food. You're not worrying about your body or those kinds of things, which is fundamentally kind of the opposite of true. It plays an even bigger role. And so we can see this in a lot of different ways. Binge eating is a lot more common for people who've experienced severe food insecurity. And that comes as a result of what we call the restrict binge cycle. And so this When we talk about restrictive eating, a lot of people just think about anorexia, but in actuality, restrictive eating plays a role in kind of all eating disorders, including binge eating. So it's often not just someone binging, but someone getting caught in this cycle, and then binging is kind of the main part of that. So if we enter kind of at the top, either the feeling of I need to gain control, so choosing to restrict, or you don't have access to food, there isn't food. So either way, there is a restriction happening. You are not eating, or you're eating is kind of below your adequate amounts of what your body needs or is hungry for. We then move into cravings, hunger, feeling out of control around food. That's a biological response that our bodies do, whether we actually don't have access to food or we are just trying not to eat. Our body is like, what the heck is going on? Like, it doesn't know that we're dieting or anything. It thinks that we are in a state of famine and that we need to eat as soon as possible. So it increases hunger cues, it increases cravings, especially if we are restricting a certain food. It will increase the amount we think about that food, because our body is trying to protect ourselves. So then when we do have access to food, or when we do, decide to eat one thing to kind of like break that restriction, we often find ourselves in a position of binging or overeating, because our body and our biological response just goes, I wasn't eating for a long time. There was probably a reason for that. I don't know when I'll get food again, so I'm going to eat as much as I can right now, because I want to be prepared for that period of restriction that might come back. So it's our body trying to protect us, trying to make sure that we stay healthy, that we have like, nutrition and food stores in our body. And then we often find ourselves in feelings of guilt or shame, thinking I failed, or I'm not good enough. My attempt at restriction failed, or I can't believe I ate that much, or those kinds of things. And then the cycle kind of begins again. And it's the same cycle whether someone is choosing not to eat, or if someone is experiencing lack of access to food. So it's kind of this feast or famine cycle in which food intake kind of oscillates. And actually a lot of food support programs can kind of like increase this cycle. So food centers that or a flow of food kind of centers around like a specific day of the week or the month. So things like, payday, or the day of the month when like the government assistance comes in, or that kind of thing. It kind of perpetuates this thing. And so having regular adequate access to food is really, really important to get out of this cycle. But so many of the programs that we see actually do not really help support getting out of this model. And so that's another kind of thing that it's important to think about. Okay. Any questions about those pieces? We kind of had to move through them kind of fast, but hopefully those kinds of two images of the functions of disordered eating and the restrict binge cycle kind of helped to kind of illustrate some of the pieces in terms of the community members that you're working with, or seeing, and kind of where their experiences are lying, and just give you a little bit kind of more background information on where those experiences are coming from. Recognizing disordered eating. Based on kind of everything we've talked about, hopefully you're feeling a little bit better in this space already, but we will kind of go through it as best we can, because there is, let's talk about it still. So these are some of the kind of changes that we might see in someone who is experiencing disordered eating, or a disordered relationship with food or their body. So behavior changes, so like dieting behaviors. Again, eating disorders are not diets, but dieting does increase your risk of struggling with an eating disorder. So it's important to make note of those dieting behaviors, especially when they are so celebrated and normalized in our society. Disappearing to bathroom after meals, that's often something that someone who is purging or doing, or like self-inducing vomiting might do. eating alone or in secret, so not wanting to eat in front of people, a preoccupation with their body and weight, body checking, so like looking at themselves in mirrors, or a thing that I used to do, I don't know why I laughed, when I was struggling with anorexia, was I was constantly like making sure that my pinky could reach my thumb around my wrist. It can't anymore, because it's not supposed to. I mean, I don't think it's like medically not supposed to. It's just mine isn't supposed to. But so just like weird body checking behaviors, like that. It can look different for everyone, but that's just one that I experienced. Development of rigid patterns that can be kind of around food or their body, or more generally, kind of that rigid black and white thinking is kind of like a behavior change that you might see. Loss of interest in what used to bring them joy, or like social withdrawal. And there is kind of like a neuroscience component of that as well. So like a part of our brain expands in times of stress. I think it's the amygdala. And so then there's another part of our brain that like is attached to our like identity of self-concept, and that can actually shrink as the other part grows. It's like a whole thing. But that's kind of a thing that you might notice, is just loss of interest in other pieces of their lives. Physical changes, fluctuations in weight, is one you might see. You also might not. A lot of people who even severely struggle with bulimia, in which they are restricting and then binging and then compensating for that behavior, whether that's through purging or exercise or more restriction, can be at like normal weights, and might not experience a fluctuation in weight at all. So that's one to be aware of, but it's not, you're not necessarily always going to see it. And then physical changes that are kind of related to stomach issues, gastrointestinal issues, because your digestive system is mad at you in a lot of ways. And then a lot of things kind of related to malnutrition and those kind of pieces. So fatigue or dizziness, brittle nails, dry mouth, dehydration, those kinds of things. Can also be things to pay attention to. And then psychological changes, which again, are not necessarily things that you're going to be able to see, but if you're regularly kind of talking to someone, you might kind of notice. So preoccupation with food, body weight or shape, body dissatisfaction, very sensitive to even neutral comments about exercise or food or body shape or weight. Anyone can be sensitive to a negative comment about any of those pieces, but even neutral comments, in terms of body, those kinds of things might be something that someone experiences. Depression, anxiety, irritability. Again, anyone can experience those things, but in conjunction with some of these other pieces might be playing a role. I think irritability was like my entire personality when I was sick, to be honest. Rigid black and white thinking, or unhelpful thinking styles. So these kind of all play a role. Someone may exhibit multiple or a few, and there is obviously more, but these are just kind of the most common ones that we might see in someone who's struggling. And obviously it's hard. These signs don't necessarily indicate that someone has an eating disorder. It can indicate a lot of other things. But these are just some of the more common ones that we want to make sure that we're flagging. Really want to touch on just medical emergencies. There is a large portion of people who have eating disorders that do not need like medical monitoring or medical intervention or those things, and who are safe to be part of, outpatient or group programming, in which medical emergencies are not a huge concern, but ensuring medical stability of someone is really, really important. Eating disorders are the second deadliest mental illness, second to the opioid crisis and opioid addiction. And a lot of that does relate to suicide. And so just wanting to be aware of what kind of red flags in terms of medical intervention are. And so if a person is immediately at risk, obviously you will kind of have like workplace protocol and policy that you would definitely want to be aware of, but calling for assistance, staying with the person until kind of that handover, following that workplace protocol, and if they kind of need any like management or anything kind of during their medical care. So if someone has accidentally or deliberately caused them self-injury, has become suicidal, disoriented, having delusions or hallucinations, if someone is vomiting several times a day, so if they disclose that they're struggling with self-induced vomiting and vomiting 2 or 3 times a day, that is cause for a trip to the emergency room. Painful muscle spasms, so that can just be a sign that your body is kind of shutting down. So that would be in conjunction with a lot of the other kind of like weight loss pieces. Chest pains or having trouble breathing, again, often kind of related to the malnutrition aspect. Fainting spells, too weak to walk. You should send them to the emergency room anyway. Blood in their bowel movements or vomit or urine, that can be a sign that something in their digestive system has ruptured as a result of the stress that it's under as they're experiencing disordered eating. So that can be really important. Regular heartbeat or very low heartbeat, and then like low things that indicate kind of low body temperature. And so those are some of the important ones that it's important for us to flag. Again, what like workplace policies for you might look different, might include additional things in terms of making sure you're doing your due diligence in supporting someone who might need medical intervention. So, follow those workplace protocols first, and then keep these things in mind in terms of what that might look like. And then just want to touch on suicidality. So people with eating disorders are at higher than average risk of death from suicide. So it is just something to be aware of. It's increased concerns when we're thinking about what those functions of disordered eating were. If the function of the disordered behavior is punishment or self-harm, or like a general apathy or neglect of physical health, that's kind of an important kind of increased concern. So, it's estimated that approximately like 70% of people with suicidal ideation or who think about suicide do not go on to make suicide attempts. But suicidal ideation is a risk factor for suicide attempts. So making sure that you are taking that seriously if that comes up. Again, I'm sure you have workplace protocol that kind of surrounds a lot of these pieces, but just wanting to flag that it is important when we're talking about eating disorders and disordered eating. I have a whole section on talking about disordered eating. I also have all of these pieces in an additional like PDF resource that I'm going to send your way as well. So I'm going to move through these pieces kind of quickly, but you will have additional resources that kind of go into them. So research shows that kids begin like equating fatness with bad between the ages of 3 and 5. So, thin being good, fat being bad, ideas about body image, what is desirable, what is good, what is safe, what is healthy, begins really, really young. And so you're really competing with a whole culture and society that is kind of against you when you're trying to undo some of this thinking. And so just recognizing that as important. The first studies that kind of documented like negative attitudes toward weight were done in like the 60s. And researchers showed children pictures of kids with like different body types, and then the kids had to like rate the images in terms of the ones they liked the most and the ones they liked the least. The larger child was consistently rated the least liked. And so we're competing with decades of social ideas in terms of body shape and size. So important to know. These are some things to consider if like diet comes up in conversation. You might, especially with younger kids, they might just use the word diet because they've heard the word diet. So actually asking like, what does that mean to you? What do you think about it? Why do you think someone might go on a diet? And then kind of really explaining them. So a diet is when someone tries to make their body smaller by eating less foods. It doesn't work. It can make you really sick, especially for kids. And so making sure that we're listening to our bodies and those kinds of things. Kind of a more useful term for younger kids, but just what if that comes up? How can we address that? If someone is using fat as an insult, which, in my school days was common, our immediate reaction might be to be like, no, like you're not fat, you're beautiful. That sentence is a lot to unpack. You can be both. Lots of people are. And instead of simply shutting down a conversation, we might ask, like, what did you mean by that? Why did you pick that word? What do you think it means for someone to be fat? And kind of explaining what that means. The reality is people come in a lot of different body sizes, and that's a great thing. People say or think that being fat is bad. That's called fat phobia, and it's a big problem that can really, really hurt people. So kind of like talking about those things. And so, you know, it might be important to explain fat phobia if, you know, they're equating fatness with like ugliness or laziness or eating too much. All of these things are not true. And so really kind of wanting to get into that. Talking about eating disorders in terms of if you are concerned about someone. So how to kind of like approach the person in a sensitive way. Obviously, again, like workplace protocol or norms and recognizing your relationships with different community members will play a role in this. And so these are just kind of like helpful tools to add into your already existing knowledge, but just approaching in a sensitive, non-judgmental manner. If you're in a place you're kind of like asking outright questions, is it okay if I ask you some questions about your eating or exercise habits? You know, these are something I always ask about, or this is something that is super common that we can often see. So I just want to make sure that you're okay. Those kinds of things of just kind of inviting in that super kind of neutral way as best you can. And so these are kind of some of our recommendations, examples of what that might look like, and examples of what that probably doesn't look like. So using compassion and validation. You know, that sounds really hard, like thank you for sharing that, those kinds of things, rather than it's not a big deal, or I know exactly what you mean. I know exactly what you mean is often so well intentioned in terms of like, yeah, like I totally can relate to you, I have experienced the same thing, but can come off as dismissive of like, yeah, like it's not a big deal, like I've been through it, it's fine, don't worry about it. So we tend to recommend like not necessarily trying to relate in that way, but instead really just trying to validate their experience. Remaining non-judgmental, so asking open-ended questions, trying to reflect on your own beliefs or biases that might be playing a role, rather than like assuming symptoms or lack thereof based on identity. And so, you know, if someone is trans or is like exploring their gender identity, don't like assume what that experience is. Oh my gosh, don't assume what the experience is based on that identity. So really kind of leaving it open for that person to define for themselves what they are experiencing is really, really important. Even if you're trying to be helpful, like if they're struggling with their words, trying to fill in words for them, those kinds of things, which again comes across so well intentioned, but or are meant so well intentioned, but can kind of come across as dismissive in some ways. Focus on emotions. I don't think any of us here are nutritionists or dietitians. If you are, love it, great. But we don't want to be making recommendations about food or exercise without like more information. So in that initial conversation or those initial conversations, really just try to focus on emotions. You know, without, you know, blood work and those kinds of things, we don't know what the health of this person is. And so just kind of focusing on emotions, which we can help with and we can kind of talk through in a good way. Practice harm reduction. So this is really important. We are big proponents of harm reduction. So, you know, not just telling someone to stop what they're doing or to just eat more, those kinds of things, but kind of assessing what they might be ready for. So maybe they're ready to look into additional supports, or maybe, you know, rather than purging, you know, 3 times a week, they're purging once a week. That's incredible. That is a great reduction of symptoms. That is amazing. And so, you know, trying to find those pieces where harm reduction can really, really play a role. And then, of course, recognize your own limits and refer out when you need to. So, you know, I'm not a dietitian. I'm not about to tell people what to eat. So just recognize what your limitations are and use additional resources when you can, which we'll kind of go through and explain. General next steps. Going to move through this fast. Increasing eating disorder literacy. There's this really cool study out of Vancouver by a young woman who experienced homelessness and food insecurity, and then went on to do her master's and kind of study the individuals in Vancouver who were experiencing homelessness. And so she just recognized that there was a huge disparity between understanding of eating disorders versus things like substance abuse. So a lot of people were able to like name and describe substance abuse and could tell you what that looked like and if they were experiencing it. But a lot of people did not know what disordered eating was, what that looked like. So one participant who discussed like making herself puke, like didn't identify that as purging or like had never heard of the word bulimia. So, you know, we have kind of this increased literacy around some pieces like substance use, which is fantastic, but wanting to kind of increase knowledge and awareness of disordered eating as well. You know, increase awareness of what an actual healthy relationship with food in your body looks like, so that disordered eating behaviors or symptoms can be noticed quicker and those kinds of pieces. So really, really important to just try to do those things. So try to increase staff and caregiver capacity for recognition and response. You're all here today. You did it. I mean, it's not done, but like you understand. Adopting like a shared language doesn't have to be like medical or like diagnosis, but kind of like using the correct language for things when they come up. You know, so purging or binging or disordered eating or something like that. Using that language and making sure that that's the norm for your staff or for your teams. Screen for or ask about disordered eating. So, you know, in the same way that you might ask about substance use or those kinds of things that you have concerns about, making sure that you're doing that same for disordered eating. Providing eating disorder resources to all. So trying to, you know, help with that kind of like prevention, making sure people are aware of the resources they might need, all of those kinds of things. And then create an environment where disordered eating or dieting is not the norm, it's not celebrated. You know, restricting your food is not something that we celebrate. Or, you know, only eating healthy foods, and, you know, refusing a cupcake is not, you know, a show of great moral character. Eating cupcakes is great. Why wouldn't you do that? So just creating an environment where disordered eating is not the norm, but listening to your body, eating foods that that taste good and, you know, are good for you emotionally, like a bowl of ice cream at the end of the night. All of those things kind of have their place in creating that kind of environment. Leading by example, so not shaming or insulting your body or food choices in front of youth or at all, if you can, just for your own wellness. And if you can, instead like celebrating or even just like practicing neutrality towards your body for what it's capable of or what it does or those kinds of things. Talk about your body or food in neutral or positive ways. You know, it doesn't always have to be like, my body's the best, but it can be like, wow, my body sure does the things that it does. Avoid commenting on other bodies, even in neutral or positive ways. Just not creating an environment where physicality or bodies are an emphasis at all. And then teaching youth that commenting on other bodies or food choices is not appropriate. So in this group, we actually really value people respecting their own bodies. And so we're not going to be commenting on them, or we're not going to be talking about their food choices. In this group, we really value people's autonomy in choosing the foods that they want, or things like that, really kind of creating that environment where those things aren't happening. Encouraging intuitive eating, so taking an all foods fit approach. Every food has its place unless you are allergic or intolerant, or for any other medical reason, all foods do not fit, all foods fit. You know, there is a place to be eating that cake or eating that ice cream, and there's lots of places to be eating those vegetables and paying attention to like nutrition in those ways. Not making comments about food in relationships to a person's weight, not engaging in restrictive eating practices, avoid offering like food as a reward. So like, you did good today, or, you know, even like, I know it's hard, but like pizza parties when you're good, it's like, you know, we don't want food to be a reward for good behavior. We want food to be something that is accessible to people at all times that doesn't rely on their moral character or their moral value. We want it to be as neutral as possible. Offer a variety of foods. Encourage being present during meals, which can be hard when there's a lot of kids going on and things are busy. But trying to encourage people to be aware of their hunger or fullness cues, not making people finish everything that's on their plate, but instead really trying to create an environment where people are only taking what they think they need. They can go back up for seconds if they want to, and just like listening to their own bodies, not being distracted, and those kinds of things is important ways to practice that. And then offer, encourage communication about food preferences. So, have them tell you what their favorite foods are, try to provide those kinds of things, and offer favorite foods without prompting. That can kind of help with, if a kid is never allowed a chocolate chip cookie in their house, that is only going to make them think about the chocolate chip cookie more and more, and kind of like increase like obsessiveness around like whatever food they are not allowed to have. And so when we can make those things accessible, it means that, kids aren't necessarily obsessing about those foods as much. And when they do have access to them, they're not going to eat an entire package of them past the point of fullness, where they're uncomfortable, because it's accessible to them. Okay, really quickly, accessing resources. There are lots of great resources available for people, community members that you might be concerned about, or that you want to offer support. At Body Brave, stepped care is like a model that is used in lots of different places. This is our stepped care model in terms of like, this is how we think about the steps of care, but it can look different in different places. This is just the one we use. So Body Brave kind of lives at 2 and 3. So we offer community-based group programming and community-based individual programming. The idea of stepped care is that someone enters at like the most helpful but least intensive form of care. So we don't want everyone to like go into day hospitalization if that's not actually what they need. We want people to enter where they actually need, based on how they are presenting, and then they can move up or down depending on different aspects. So this is kind of the model that we use, and Body Brave lives at step 2 or 3. In this presentation, which you will all get access to, we have a list of, so these are all the community-based group programming that's available to people in Ontario. These are all the hospital-based outpatient programming, day hospitals, all of those kinds of things. So they're all here in this resource, and please feel free to explore them, but just so you know kind of where to be sending people. A lot of them are ages 17 plus. There are quite a few. So Danielle's Place, Looking Glass Foundation, that offer support for people who are younger than 17. A lot of times it's, insurance and policy and all those kinds of things that play a role, but definitely reach out if you do have someone that you're specifically concerned about and want to find support for them. You could always email us at Body Brave, and we will try to help find the resource that works best for them. Additionally, in this presentation, there's a bunch of additional resources that you can look out. There's like additional training here, which are all really, really cool and really good. And then I love references. So there's like 10 pages of references because I just think they're so important. But you'll have access to all of these things, and they will be sent your way. But that was a very fast, and I appreciate your time version of eating disorder care and kind of building your capacity. We have time for a few questions. Are there any questions or comments or concerns that anyone wants to ask or flesh out or kind of bring into this space while you're kind of all together? Yes, I will email all the resources and stuff to Sandra, and then she will kind of disseminate to the respective people. So yes, all the information will be there. But just, yeah, in this space while you're all together, are there any questions or pieces that anyone wanted to bring up?
Can we stop the recording during this piece?